Professor Shelly Kagan is a professor of philosophy at Yale University. Much of his work centers around the debate between consequentialists and deontological moral theories, and the connections between Kantism and consequentialism. While he has written about moral philosophy and normative ethics, Professor Kagan is probably best well known for his lectures and books surrounding the topic of death and whether immortality is truly desirable. So I hope you'll all join me in a warm welcome for Professor Kagan.
Thanks very much. It is a pleasure to be here. My understanding is the format was simply that you guys have prepared some questions and you're going to shoot them at me. I don't have any opening remarks. I hope that's right. So just take it away, whatever form you've got.
Yeah, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Sure. Well, as you say, I specialize in moral philosophy, although I'm probably best known for my stuff on death. I teach a class on death periodically, and the videotapes of that are available online. And bizarrely enough, they made me famous around the world. That was certainly the most unexpected turn my career ever took. But I mostly work in moral philosophy, in particular normative ethics, the part of moral philosophy where you try to figure out what the basic rules about right and wrong are, and what the details are, how to systematize them. But as I say, the death stuff is the stuff I'm probably most well known for.
Okay, hands up, guys. Question.
Charlie. I know you previously debated William Lane Craig about whether God is necessary for morality. Could you sum up your argument in a couple of sentences, maybe, please?
Yeah, good. So I don't know what to do with life and death stuff, but I don't care. I'll answer whatever questions you've got as long as it's not about sports, because I don't know anything about sports. It's a common thought that if you're going to have anything like objective morality, you've got to have it based on God. And that was the debate I had with this guy, Craig, that you just referred to. This is, gosh, at least 10 or more years ago. I can't remember when it took place, where he was defending the claim that morality does require belief in God, and I was saying, no, it doesn't. That's not to say that there's any incompatibility with morality and being a theist, but the question is, can we make sense of there being objective facts about right and wrong that don't appeal to anything theistic? And for the sake of kind of an easy to get your head around theory, I talked about in that particular debate, I talked about a contract theory or contractarian theory of morality, according to which right and wrong might be a matter of, imagine that we were trying to come up with some rules to govern our interactions with one another. It's really important to me that you not kill me when I'm sleeping and steal my food. And so I might strike a deal with you. I agree not to kill you in exchange for you agreeing not to kill me. It's really important for me to get my way around town where I'm a stranger, but you know your way around town. And so I make a deal with you. You agree to tell me the truth when I ask you questions and not tell lies, and I agree to tell you the truth and not tell lies. We could see how if you kind of imagine us all getting together and trying to come up as rational individuals with the rules that would govern our interactions with one another, we might well come up with rules, something like the rules of common sense morality. Don't tell lies, keep your promises, don't hurt innocent people, and the like. And so this is an approach to the ultimate basis of morality that gets called contractarianism. You think of morality as a kind of social contract. And the point is that we didn't need to bring God into that in order to give a defense of morality. Now, that may or may not be the best account, but it does at least suggest, and this is what I was trying to suggest in my argument, my debate with Craig, that we don't need to have morality be based on belief in God. You could even believe that God exists and tells us to be good people without thinking that right and wrong is right and wrong because God says so. It might well be the other way around, that God sees what right and wrong would be. And so since he cares about us and loves us all, tells us to do the right thing. That still wouldn't be an account of morality that's based on God. Anyway, that's the sort of thing that I was doing in my debate with Craig.
Professor Craig, Professor Kagan, my question is, do you think people should be obliged to be moral?
Well, so are people obligated to be moral? I think that's the question. We might ask, well, what do you mean by obligated? All right, and here's a natural proposal about talking about what you're obliged to do, what you're obligated to do. You might think it means something like, well, what are you morally required to do? And if that's the question, if that's the right way to translate the question, then you're saying something like, are you morally required to meet your moral requirements? And then the answer seems like it's going to be, well, duh. Of course you are. What else could, to say that something's a moral requirement, what else could it mean other than that you're morally required to do what you're morally required to do? Maybe there's some other way of understanding the question. Sometimes people ask the question, why should I pay attention to morality? And maybe that's what you're trying to get at. Wondering, yeah, here's a bunch of moral requirements, but why should I do what morality says? Where the should here better not be a moral should. It's going to have to be some other kind of should. So, for example, people sometimes say, maybe when people ask the question, why should I be moral? What they really mean is, from the rational point of view, why should I do what morality tells me to do? In other words, is it rational to be moral? Now, that's not a silly question anymore. That's a question that seems like it's got some content. And we could argue about whether reason supports paying attention to morality. I mean, we could easily imagine all sorts of codes of conduct that we think are stupid or irrational or misinformed. If we found some Hitler Youth, Nazi youth handbook telling us, we must all turn in Jews, and do whatever the Fuhrer says, we might well ask, why should I do what this book says? So if you write down all the moral rules, you might well ask, why should I do what the moral rule book says? That's a perfectly interesting question. And indeed, it's a question that moral philosophers have worried about throughout the entire history of morality. So hang on a second, I'm just gonna, I realized that I was worried about getting so close to the camera that I could no longer be visible. So I want to put my screen back on so I can see myself. All right, so moral philosophers throughout history have wondered about that question and have offered different answers. And I don't have time now to rehearse all the best answers that have ever been offered, but consider the contractarian story that I just mentioned a minute ago. And this actually connects back to the thing about religion. You might think, here's the only reason to be moral, because God's going to send you to hell otherwise. Well, that would be a pretty good reason to be moral, I suppose. But it's not necessarily the only reason to be moral. It may not even be the best reason to be moral. Take the contractarian theory that I sketched very quickly a minute or two ago. Why should I obey these rules of morality? Well, roughly speaking, because in order to get you to agree not to kill me, I had to agree not to kill you. If I start going around breaking the rules, then it becomes like open hunting season. Then you're going to start feeling free to go around breaking the rules. And so there might well be reason, it might well be rational, if we have a contractarian theory of what morality is all about. It might well be rational for me to continue obeying these rules, because that's part of the deal, and we all need to participate in the deal in order to keep the deal going. You've all probably been members of clubs where people stopped doing whatever it was the club asked, and the club kind of dissolved. Well, that's the danger from the contractarian point of view. And so given how important it is for me to have you keep up your side of the bargain, if the cost for me of doing that is my keeping up my side of the bargain, then I've got reason to do it. I lose something. I lose the ability to kill you, but I win a whole lot more. I get the protections against your killing me. So this is an example of a kind of answer one can give about why one should be moral, where the question is no longer, well, duh, of course, morally you should be moral. It's why is it rational to be moral? And there are other answers that have been offered. Kant famously thought that morality is ultimately based on reason, but he had a different path from rationality to morality, having to do with the thought that reasons are all universal. If I have a reason to do something because of certain truths about me, then you have a reason to do those same things if the same things are true about you. I'm going to skip over the details of all this, but Kant thought if you take this idea seriously, you're pretty quickly led to some fundamental moral rules. So that's a rather different story about why is it reasonable, why is it rational to obey morality. And so there are contractarian stories, there are Kantian stories. There's a number of theories out there. One of which is the religious story. I just don't think it's the only one that's available to us.
I'd like to think that I'm free, but I've struggled to convince my students on paper that that's the case. What's your view about human freedom and the best way to try and defend it?
Yeah, so good. So, right, if we think, we normally do take ourselves to have free will. I promised to be here for this session, but presumably I had the ability to, when it was 11:42 and I was turning on my Zoom connection, clicking the link. I could have said, screw them. They're not paying me. I don't need to do this. So we take ourselves to have free will. And so then the question becomes, well, why should we think that that's an illusion? I think this is a more general methodological point. You should start by thinking that things are the way they seem to be. You're justified in thinking things are the way they look until you come up with some good argument to the contrary. And often there are good arguments. So now we have to ask, is there any good argument for deciding we don't have free will? And the sort of thing that I think gives most people trouble is worrying about determinism. The thought that there are various laws of nature, that I can't change the laws of nature. And if the laws of nature have a deterministic form, I'll come back to what that means in a second, then it's very tempting to think, this is probably what most people think, and maybe your students think, that one cannot combine free will and determinism. So what's determinism? Well, determinism means that when you set up the world in a certain way and kind of press go, so you've got some initial conditions, then the world is going to continue to evolve in a certain way based on the laws of nature. It has to move from state 1 to state 2 to state 3, such that given the way it was set up at the beginning, and given the laws of nature, it was inevitable, it was determined that the world would evolve and result in the way it did. If that's right, if the laws of nature really are deterministic, then it looks as though it should mean that there was a way the world was 1 billion years ago, such that the way the world was 1 billion years ago, plus the laws of nature, boom, 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 that made the way the world was going to be 1 million years ago, 1,000 years ago, 10 years ago, a year ago, a week ago, yesterday. And if everything's determined, it meant that it was determined 1 billion years ago that I would click the link on the Zoom thing at 11:42. And then you might think, well, in that case, how could I really be free if it was all in the bag 1 billion years ago before I was even born? So that's the so-called before birth argument for saying that you can't combine free will and determinism. And I think it's a pretty powerful argument. Unfortunately, it's much easier to feel the force of the argument than to do what you asked me to do, which is to show where the argument goes wrong. I do, in fact, think the argument goes wrong. Spelling that out is a complicated, why it goes wrong is a complicated thing to do. Let me mention one thing I think won't really help, and then very, very quickly sketch something that I think is more promising, but I won't be able to say enough to convince you, let alone your students. Sometimes people say, look, quantum mechanics, our best theory of quantum mechanics is that the laws of nature at the fundamental level are not deterministic. Now, believe me, I don't know enough about quantum mechanics to know whether that's right or not, and so who knows. But the dominant interpretation of quantum mechanics is that, contrary to what I was suggesting a minute ago, if you've got some atom in a certain state and you press go, it won't inevitably go the way it goes. There'll just be certain probabilities. If you've got a radioactive atom, and maybe it's got a 20% chance that it will decay in the next week, and an 80% chance that it won't decay. And if it decays and you ask, why did it decay? All you can say is, well, there was a 20% chance it would, and it did. And if it doesn't decay, and you say, why didn't it decay? You can say, well, there was an 80% chance that it wouldn't, and it didn't. And there's no deeper explanation. You could have two identical atoms, both set up exactly the same way, and some of them will decay and some of them won't. If that's right, then at the fundamental level, the laws of physics are not deterministic. And so then you might think, all right, even if it's true that we can't combine free will and determinism, doesn't matter because the laws of nature are not deterministic. Sometimes people say that. I think that's not really going to help because even if the laws of nature are probabilistic at the fundamental level, by the time you get up to huge macro objects like us, for all practical purposes, we're deterministic systems. You know, there's a 1 in a gazillion chance that something weird will happen. You can't see my table. There's my table over here. I punched the table. You know, according to quantum mechanics, there's a 1 in a gazillion chance my hand would go through the table because of quantum tunneling. For all practical purposes, at the macro level, even if the probabilistic interpretation of the laws of physics are correct, for all practical purposes, we still live at a deterministic level. So I think that way of saving free will won't work. What's the more promising way? There are philosophers, and I am one of them, there are philosophers who think that you can combine free will and determinism. This view, that they're compatible, this view is called compatibilism, unlike the view that says you can't combine them, which is called incompatibilism. I happen to be a compatibilist. I think free will is ultimately a matter of being able to think through the reasons for or and against doing something, and then acting accordingly. And this is an ability that I think we actually have. Maybe not everybody's got it in every circumstance. You know, the drug addict might see that there's reasons not to shoot up, but can't choose accordingly. But we are, roughly speaking, you know, roughly we're hardwired to be able to evaluate reasons, not perfectly, but pretty well, and choose accordingly. So to give a very quick example, and then I'll try to move on and say this is a very complicated subject. But I share this example sometimes with my students in my ethics class where we're talking about this question of free will. If you hypnotize me and give me a post-hypnotic suggestion to stay in Connecticut Hall, that's the building that I'm in, even if the building catches on fire, and the building then does catch on fire, there's a good reason for me to leave the building, but I can't shape my behavior in response to recognizing those reasons because I've been basically brainwashed by post-hypnotic suggestion. But in contrast, in an ordinary case, even if right now I'm in Connecticut Hall with you, if the fire alarm were suddenly to go off and my person down the hall says, Shelly, get out of the building's on fire, I would now have a good reason to get out of the building, and I would do it. So I think that's a case that differentiates ordinary decision-making from brainwashing or hypnosis or drug addiction. The cases of lack of free will are cases where you can't really shape your behavior with an eye towards the relevant reasons. Free will is a matter of being able to think for yourself what the good reasons are, form a judgment, and then act on it. And that is something I think we've got, and it's perfectly compatible with determinism. So that's why I myself am a compatibilist. But you know, it's a contentious question, and you know, if we wanted to devote all the remaining 15 minutes or how much more time we've got, you still wouldn't say enough to convince everybody. But at least it gives you a glimmer of the sort of position I want to take.
Do you think we're born with an internal sense of right and wrong, or is it learned from an external source? And if so, what is that source?
Yeah, great. So, and I suppose what I should say is that's an interesting question for a psychologist to answer. You know, is it a part of human nature that we're born with some kind of moral sense? Is it innate, as you put it? That's just another way of getting to the same point. Or is it all learned? And what I suspect is it's a mixture of the two, that a certain amount of our moral outlook is hardwired into us. By hardwired, I don't really mean we couldn't overcome it. You know, maybe we have enough free will that if we thought that there were reasons to, I mean, you know, for all I know, we're hardwired men are hardwired to be sexist pigs. I don't know. But that doesn't mean that we can't think about it and get socialized into overcoming that hardwiring. So yeah, here's a question for psychologists, anthropologists, animal scientists to study. Do we see anything like morality in any of the lower animals? So let me give you two quick examples. As it happens, I've got colleagues in the psychology department here who study these things, and so I know a little bit about it, but not very much. One, I have a colleague who works with monkeys, and as I say, she's in the psych department. She works with monkeys, and she trains her monkeys. These are not in the lab. She goes to an island that's overrun by these types of monkeys, and so she goes to this island, and she trains the monkeys to make deals. You know, she'll give the monkeys whatever it is, you know, peanuts, and she'll have bananas, and she'll train the monkeys. You know, okay, you give me your peanuts, and I'll give you my bananas, right? And they know how to make they learn how to make deals. So that's great. Okay, all right. Step two. She offers to make one of these deals with the monkeys. She gets them to give them their bananas, their peanuts, and then she doesn't give them her bananas. And what happens? The monkeys get really pissed at her, right? So why? Because she's cheating them. And so it's arguable that the monkeys have some sense and you know of justice and fairness. They know what a deal is, and who's keeping up their end and who isn't keeping up their end of the bargain. And so it seems pretty likely from an evolutionary point of view that if some of the great apes and the more advanced monkeys have some sense of morality, then we probably inherited some of that as well. Here's another example, quick second example. If you imagine you put a rat in a certain kind of cage where it has to make a choice. You know, it's in a big space where it's got to make a choice. It can either go get some food for itself, or it can free another rat that's in a tiny cage. But you somehow get it to, you know, by putting it through this setup a couple of times, you get it to realize that this is a one-time or only choice, right? You can't if you choose food, your fellow rat stays in the tiny cage. If you free your fellow rat, you lose the chance for food. Rats will free their fellow rats. And so there's something like compassion going on in rats. And so it would be hard to believe that, well, they should have this built-in innate, and we don't. So I'm inclined to think at least some of the rudiments of morality are hardwired in us. After all sorts of things are hardwired into us. Babies have an idea of object permanence. You know, if you show a baby a ball and then put a screen in front of the ball, and then when the baby's not looking, you move the ball behind the screen, and then you lift the screen and the ball's not there, the baby is surprised. Well, why is it? Because it's innate. It's hardwired into us to believe that objects don't just disappear on their own. It would be shocking if there wasn't some similar stuff about morality that was hardwired into us. But of course, for all that doesn't mean that it's all hardwired in the sense that we can't refine and revise and expand our sense of things and learn more about right and wrong. And society has made all sorts of progress over you know, the millennia you know, of human existence. And so it's pretty plausible, I think, to think that part of the answer is some of this stuff's human nature, and some of this stuff is stuff that we've figured out, starting with the inputs from human nature, but then using our reason to systematize, to throw out the parts that don't make sense, and so forth and so on. So I think it's likely to be a mixture of the both, of the two.
Does anyone have questions about the body and the soul? So,
yeah. You remember once upon a time this was going to be a session on bodies and souls. It's okay with me if nobody asks the question, but maybe Sam will be happier if something is on the subject.
go on then, Theo.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could expand a bit on your views on immortality and the afterlife and why it may not be desirable.
Yeah, right. So that is in fact my view. You know, almost everybody wishes that there was a soul so that we could live forever even after our body dies, you know, and if we're lucky, make it into heaven. This is, you know, a lot of appeal for a lot of religions, the prospect of immortality. This is not a unique thought to me. There's no longer alive, but there's a famous British philosopher named Bernard Williams, 20th century philosopher, who argued that you know what, when you actually try to spell out what it would be like to live forever, there is no way to make that end up seeming all that desirable. And you know, I discuss this issue with my students, you know, all the time, and you know, they don't all agree with me. And so I can only just throw this out for you as a thought experiment. Try to imagine a life and that you would want to live forever. And the crucial thing about forever is it's, well, it's forever. You know, I like certain types of food. I could happily have them for a very long time, but eventually they get boring. I love doing philosophy. I could easily imagine that doing philosophy for, you know, hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, maybe tens of thousands of years would be a really interesting way to be able to live. But eventually, I think philosophy would get boring. Now, of course, you know, immortality doesn't have to just be one thing. You can rotate. You know, you could do philosophy for 1,000 years, and then maybe take up pottery for 1,000 years, or maybe it's, you know, do philosophy Monday, Wednesdays, Fridays, and pottery Tuesdays and Thursdays, and on Saturdays go to art museums. You know, and on Sundays travel intergalactic galaxies. The thing you've got to ask yourself is there anything at all that would never, or any combination of things that would never, ever, ever get boring? I mean, think about, to take a kind of trivial example, I don't know whether any of you guys like doing crossword puzzles. I don't myself, but I know that people do like doing, a lot of people like doing crossword puzzles, or, you know, jigsaw puzzles or something like that. But I imagine that anybody after 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years, a million years, whatever it is, might eventually find themselves saying something like, here's a crossword puzzle I've never seen before, but so what? I'm just tired of doing crossword puzzles. The fact that it's a new one doesn't hold out any thrill for me anymore. I've gotten what there is to get out of doing crossword puzzles. Now, art, great art, is much more rich and deep and rewarding and satisfying and intriguing and gripping than crossword puzzles. So maybe great works of art would be good for 1 million years, or 10 million years, or 1 billion years, or 1 trillion years. But I find myself thinking that after a certain while, when you say to me, oh, here's an art museum with some artworks you've never seen before, I would find myself wanting to say, yeah, I'm sure there are some paintings there, let's say, that I've never seen before. But so what? I've gotten what there is to get out of art. Visual art no longer thrills me, no longer deepens or touches my soul. I'm bored with it. So the worry I've got is that whatever it is that you would do, sooner or later would get boring. Might take a bit. I mean, Williams thought it would happen within a couple of decades. I think he's pessimistic about that. I'd happily live for a much longer time than that. I'm fairly confident that I'm a lot older than you guys. I'm going to die well before I've gotten tired of what life can offer me. But I do nonetheless think that sooner or later, whether it's thousands of years or millions of years, it would all get tiring. And so the thing to do, I think, the best wouldn't be immortality, it would be being able to live doing what you want to do for as long as you wanted to do it. And when it was no longer the case that you wanted to do it, being able to stop. So I think nobody would actually choose to be immortal on that. But living as long as you wanted to, that strikes me as that would be a really desirable thing to have happen. Who's next?
How do you define death, and how does it interact with human behaviors and motivations, if at all? And should it be?
Good. So actually, the question, how should you define death, turns out to be a surprisingly difficult thing to do. It partly is going to turn on what is the metaphysical glue that makes you you, right? So there's somebody that was you yesterday, and there's somebody that's you today, and you know, God willing, there'll be somebody around tomorrow that'll be you. But 1 million years from now, there'll still be somebody's around, but none of them will be you. So what does it take for a future somebody to be you? Death is basically when there's nobody around anymore that's you. I'm simplifying a bit, but that'll do for our purposes. But to answer that, we need to get clear on what's the metaphysical glue. And there are two basic schools of thought. There's a lot of other details, but two basic schools of thought. Well, three. One is, it's a matter of, is there somebody that's got your immortal soul, your non-physical being as an essence and a soul? I don't myself believe there are such things, but that was the third view. So the two things that I think are possible, one is there somebody around that still has your body? Same body means it's still you. And another slightly different view says, is it somebody that has what I'll somewhat simplistically call your personality? Somebody with your memories, your beliefs, your desires. And so, if we conked you on the head, gave you amnesia, and there was no way for you to ever remember your childhood, and you had totally different interests and desires, right now you like classical music, but you wake up and suddenly you're totally taken by Japanese bamboo flute music. You have no memories, no desires, totally different goals, totally different set of ambitions. On some views, that would no longer be you. We'd say, well, you died. Your body's still around, but you're not. All right, so how we define death is partially going to turn on which of those two theories, follow the body or follow the personality, or if we believe in souls, follow the soul, is the key. For those of you who do believe in souls, let me just take a moment and say why it's not obvious that even if there are souls, that's the right answer. This is a view that John Locke, the great British philosopher, an argument that he made. He said, look, imagine that every night while you're asleep, God destroys your soul and replaces it with a brand new soul, with all of your memories, all of your beliefs, all of your desires, all of your hopes, all of your fears. So each morning you wake up saying, all right, I've got to do my schoolwork today. I didn't finish my homework yesterday. Right? Well, on the follow the soul view, that isn't really you, because you died when your soul got destroyed. But Locke said, that's a crazy thing to say. Of course that's you. So Locke thought, follow your memories and beliefs. That's roughly the view he took. Other people today follow the body. So how to define death is going to depend on when is it the soul got destroyed, or is it the body got destroyed, or is it because we could have cases where the desires and the personality stuff continues, but the body gets destroyed. Imagine, this is going to be sort of science fiction-y, but imagine, but this may well happen in some of your lifetimes, that we end up being able to synthesize new bodies. And so when your old body is about to give out, we upload your personality, all your memories, all your beliefs onto the cloud. And then we download it from the cloud onto a new replacement body. Well, and then you wake up, or somebody wakes up, and says, oh, I've got to finish my homework assignment. I got that extension, but because I was getting the body replacement, but time's running out. On the follow the body view, that ain't you that woke up. You died, right? There's a new imitation you that thinks it's you, doesn't realize it's not you, but it's not you, because you got to follow the body. But on the follow the personality view, oh, you got a new body. You swapped out your body. You could get a heart transplant. You can get a liver transplant. It turns out you can get an entire body transplant. But since it's the same set of beliefs and desires and memories and so forth and so on, that's you. So how we define death is going to depend on what we want to say about this metaphysical question. What's the key to being you? What's the key to personal identity? Suppose you solved all of that. The other half of your question was, how should the fact, I think this is the other half of your question, how should the fact that we're going to die influence how we live? Some people think that that's the key to thinking about how to live. Kafka, the great German writer, said, the secret of life is that it ends. So, and this is a common enough thought, that the key thing in deciding how to live is realizing that you're going to die. And this sort of thing shows up in various religious traditions as well. I'm Jewish, the Jewish religious tradition, like others, will say, live each day as though it's going to be your last, right? I'm sure you've known some version of this. And personally, for what it's worth, my own view is that's horrible advice. If you lived each day as though it was going to be your last, you wouldn't be here in this class, in this club right now, trying to, learn philosophy so as to take your whatever the exams are that you guys are, are prepping for. You wouldn't go to medical school if you thought each day was going to go to the last. You'd go to Disneyland if it was your last day or something. So live each day as though it's your last. It's a horrible. Similarly, I don't think the key to deciding how to live is, that death is going to reveal that. I do think it reveals something important. The fact that we're going to die, and then you combine this with, other things that I believe that I haven't really gotten into today, that, I think when your body dies, that'll be the end of it. You won't survive. There's no soul to make it up to heaven you continue being you. So it seems to me. So, to kind of boil this down to a slogan, I don't know if in Britain you've got this expression, do-overs, a chance to do something a second time. That's what my kids used to talk about, having do-overs. And I think what we learn from thinking about the fact of our mortality is there are no do-overs. If you squander your life, you've only got whatever it is. Some people are unlucky enough to only have 10 or 20 years. With luck, you'll have 60 more years, 70 more years, maybe 80 more years, maybe even longer because of improvements in medicine by the time you're getting up there. But you're going to have let's just suppose 100 years, and then you're going to die, and you won't get anything else after that. And I think it's really important to ask yourself, given that I only have 100 years, how should those 100 years be spent? I'm sure you guys are familiar with the idea of a midlife crisis. A midlife crisis is when somebody at the age of 40 or 50, they set themselves certain goals. Maybe they chose a profession. At the age of 40 or 50, they've achieved what they set out to do. But now, having gotten it, instead of feeling like they got the stuff that was really worth having, they find themselves thinking, is this all there was? Was this really what I was supposed to be doing with my life? And they worry that they've wasted it. And so the thing to do when you are your age or the next several years is to figure out what's the stuff that's really worth having in life. What are the things that are really worth going after as a kind of, we don't get an instruction manual, but these are the years in which you're supposed to be asking yourself those questions. So as to try to minimize the chance that you wake up 40 years from now or 30 years from now, realizing I can't believe I wasted the last 30, 40 years. And now I've only got a few more decades left. I can't, kind of start all over again. So what facing our mortality does is help us see that this time through is the only time through. And there's not going to be, so it seems to me, there's not going to be an afterlife. So you don't want to waste it. You don't want to squander it. Death teaches us that. I mean, the fact of death, the fact of our mortality teaches us that. Now, of course, we then have to ask, all right, so what really is worth going after? What are the things that are genuinely gold and not fool's gold? What are the things that 30 years later, 40 years later, 50 years later, I'm most likely to look back and say, yeah, this was a life well spent. I don't think the fact of our mortality answers that question. We have to go to other parts of philosophy to do that. So I think death or facing our mortality tells us what question to ask, namely, how can we live a life without squandering it, but doesn't provide the answer. That's a different question for a different day or a different philosophy class or a different set of books or what have you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kagan. I'm sure I speak for all of us when I say that was an extremely interesting and informative Q&A. I know we all learned a lot. I particularly enjoyed your comments on where morality comes from. So yeah, should we all show our appreciation?
Well, thank you very much. It's kind of you to invite me. And if I do remember correctly that you're partially prepping for some exams, good luck on your exams.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Bye-bye, everybody.
Your busy schedule, appreciate that.
It was my pleasure. Take care.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too.